This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.
Kia ora, assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. First episode for the year 2026, baby. I hope everyone has had an amazing end of year holiday season. Regardless of what you got up to, I hope you had the opportunity to just rest. I know there's a lot of expectations around this time of the year, but however it came about, I hope it was just a time of goodness for everyone. I really want to start this year talking about identity, and I know I've been on one with identity at the moment, but it's just so important. I feel like once you, like, just in life in general, not just specifically about the podcast, but so much comes from really knowing who you are, and so much power and strength and resilience can come from your identity. And I think this is a great place to start this year, to set us up for another wonderful year of Headscarves and Good Yarns. And you know me, we are going to get political about it, but identity is something that's just so personal. And I think when it comes to any kaupapa, your activism benefits if you can weave it into your personal world, and it's not just something that's information based or theoretical or based on analysis. And don't get me wrong, that is really important, but that sense of solidarity and the commitment and the dedication really, and that curiosity and that empathy really comes from when you make it personal. And there's nothing more personal than your identity. And so I really wanted to start the year talking about identity politics versus just our human complexity. Because as our queen Roxane Gay put it, they said identity is both a lens and a trap. And, I'm not too sure what the forecast for 2026 is going to look like, but it just seems like everything is happening all at once, with the increase in red pill masculinity and the masculinity, Andrew Tate influences, the misinformation cycles that just take off before fact checking is happening. Fact checking cannot keep up with how fast misinformation moves. Climate disasters that feel weekly, the quote unquote privilege panic where everyone's really scared of getting it wrong, and high key that constant just exhaustion of just being online. And somehow in the middle of that, we are all just trying to figure out who we are, and I feel like it's hard to show up ethically in a space where it's just becoming quite extreme and polarized. And I think what I really want to ask in this question is, how do we center identity without getting trapped in identity performance? We're peeling back the tensions and the contradictions, the hope, the harm, the confusion, and, we're really going to get into it. And I think a really good place to start is just talking about the fact that, identity is not it's a new thing, identity politics definitely didn't start with online think pieces or TikTok infographics or Instagram infographics as well. And I think identity, is really important. If we think back to the Combahee River Collective, a group of Black lesbian feminists said, you know, we need language that explains how systems harm people differently. So when you think about it like that, it's not just a brand, it's not like a curated vibe. It's a language that is looking like a political diagnostic tool, right? It's a way of naming injustice with clarity. But if we kind of think about how our relationship to identity now, it's kind of changed. You know, we've kind of moved from identity as an analysis or a diagnostic tool or a way to understand ourselves in the world more to kind of like identity as an aesthetic. And I feel like the internet really reinforces that. You know, we have, if I think back to my algorithm, we've got the clean girl but make it Muslim, the brown girl self-care era, and yeah, I think it's interesting. There's a sociologist called, I feel like I'm going to pronounce their name incorrectly, but I'll try my best, Zygmunt Bauman. And he kind of predicted this shift. He said that, you know, made the argument that late modern life turns identity into something we assemble and display, not something we inherit organically. So, you know, now identity narratives, they're not just a personal thing, they've become more performative. And so we're not just like living our identities, we're curating them. And if you think about like this shift in how we view identity, how we experience identity, coupled with the polarization that is happening, coupled with just the way we use internet now is quite different. It just seems like it's embedded and enmeshed into our lives. And I think, you know, the internet does not reward complexity. And I think the internet hates incompleteness, especially when you think about like identity is something that's always in process and it's never complete. It's not like we reach a spot and it's like, this is it, I've reached saturation point and I'm never going to learn anything, or I'm never going to change my mind about anything. It's a forever thing. It's a forever learning thing. But I think, that internet does not like that, the forever learning vibes. It likes completion. And, if you think about it, like TikTok very much rewards certainty. Instagram rewards polish. Twitter, X, rewards the hottest take delivered the fastest. And I feel like we are constantly kind of living in this tension. So, which is tough because identity is fluid, but online identity is treated as a finished product. And the gap between those two things, there is just friction there. And I really want to talk about this, particularly at the beginning of the year, is because I feel like identity, as our world is, the more that is happening, and, regardless of where you lie on the political spectrum, or regardless of, what you think about the world, there are so many things that are happening, and so many movements are happening across the world, and there's all of these natural disasters that are happening. You read the news and so much is going down that, I feel like we need to have a not more than just a chat, but, solutions come from the conversations. But we as a collective, as a world, we need to have a chat about our systems and the impacts that they have, and who they harm and who they champion and who they silence and who they favor. And with all of this stuff happening, like the tension is getting bigger, and that friction is getting harder to ignore. So regardless of, how you feel or think about the world and what's happening, that friction is happening more. And it's going to get to a point where we can no longer ignore the heat. And I feel like if we were all more open and knowledgeable about our own identities, we could have, those nuanced, uncomfortable but much needed conversations, and how we feel about our identity is going to become even more important. We're living through overlapping global crises, in every sense, political, economic, environmental, and social. And when stuff like that happens, there is an instability that makes people crave clarity. Karen Stenner, who is a political psychologist, says that people don't reject diversity, they reject complexity under threat. But if you think about it, none of this is simple. None of this is going to be put into a neat box or a neat label. The level of complexity that we need to acknowledge and hold while we're thinking about how to deal with this increasing friction in our world, we need to be able to handle that complexity. And, it is a nuanced, layered thing, but I feel like a huge part of being able to hold that complexity is to be, aware and more confident and to our identity. And the reason why it's so important is because knowing who you are, it informs how you move through this world and the lens in which you see this world. Your identity becomes a map, a shield, a tribe, a storyline, a shorthand, a form of emotional security. And so if we're living in a time where we're craving that clarity, and in this time when we're craving clarity, we reject complexity. It's very easy to reject that complexity when your identity is telling you a certain story. If the map that you're referring to has, been the one that you would just, being given as a result of your environment and your lived experience, instead of looking at the map and being like, why, and questioning what is on my map and how is it guiding me and how I move through this world. And, I think you can see that rejection of complexity when you think about the trad wife resurgence, because femininity, I feel like I said that word wrong, is simpler than feminism. There's a huge, there's a big anti-woke backlash, and you do see that this sentiment a lot, which is, I miss when things were straightforward. The increasing transphobia. If gender is fluid, what anchors me? there's the racial reckoning fatigue. You know, I'm tired of talking about racism, but scared to stop talking about racism. The increase in anti-immigration sentiments that are happening, the increased, you know, rise of the right, and Ulrich Beck is a sociologist and has the idea of a risk society. So when everything feels risky, identities become safety mechanisms. And it very much fits in with what, you know, Karen Stenner was saying about rejecting complexity under threat. And that threat and friction, is on our necks at the moment with, you know, everything that's happening. So you can see how identities can become safety mechanisms in that time. And then there's also privilege panic. Thank you, Phoebe Maltz-Bovey, for the word. You know, where people become terrified of being seen as privileged, so they cling to identity categories to kind of establish that legitimacy. And so I think this is why, you know, talking about identity just feels so intense these days. And so when you think about it, like, people are not fighting about identity, they're fighting for psychological safety. But you can see how identity is used that way. And I think when there is, you know, when identities do become safety mechanisms and people just want that simplicity, you can see how identities can become an easy thing to kind of fall back on to justify the simple way of looking at the world. But nothing about this is simple. It is very complex, very, very complex, but you can see how it's much easier to do that, to use identity as a safety mechanism. And when identities become safety mechanisms, it's really easy for the, you know, systems to socialize our feelings, right? If there's a valid fear there about the uncertainty of our future, you can see how the system can socialize those feelings, and, you know, all of a sudden we are scared and, you know, blame immigrants for the state of the world right now. Like, I know that I've mentioned this video in an earlier episode, but I was watching this YouTube video with my husband, and this guy, he's half white, half black, and he went like undercover as a white person when they had that like anti-immigration march in the UK, just to interview people. And I think, you know, the whole point of it was to, like, it was very much giving MAGA vibes, like, make, you know, Britain great again, which AKA means, you know, make Britain white again. And everything that people were saying, you could just see how identity had become a safety mechanism, and, you know, their fear and uncertainty had just been, like, socialized into, you know, the worldview that they landed on, to the point where, you know, they came to this rally. And so I think it's really important, when identity is so important to how we navigate through this world, it's really important that it's something that we invest in. And in our online world, I think it's really important, even more so, because the internet loves binaries, but us humans, we don't fit into them. You know, complexity doesn't go viral, simplicity does. You know, communication theorist Marshall McLuhan argues that the medium shapes the message. And so these days online, the mediums reward certainty, outrage, clarity, sides, simplified morality. And so, all of a sudden nuance becomes something that is suspicious. Even to say something like this is complicated, then the accusations of like being apolitical or neutral or, centering yourself swiftly follows. And, I think a really good reminder here from Amina Mama is that liberation requires complexity, not performance. And as I'm saying this, I do want to put this caveat out there. And as I said in the episode before, like, of course, there's kind of like a line to this. Like, there are some things that aren't that complicated, but, our system likes to tell us that it is. But I'm talking about things that are in that, quote unquote gray zone. And I think when simplicity is encouraged, is almost impossible to, really question things. Like, even if, I've started thinking a certain way about something and I haven't changed my mind about this particular thing, or there's a particular particular aspect of my identity, and I've decided that I haven't changed how I think about this. Every single time where I've like welcomed that complexity, it's given me a different angle to think about things. It's given me a lot more empathy and awareness. Like, there's always an education there when you embrace that complexity. And I think something that just a quick example that kind of shows how complexity isn't encouraged but simplicity is viral. When Beyonce dropped Cowboy Carter, the fights online were insane about, whether it was black enough or country enough or political enough or subversive enough. And I think the nuance with Cowboy Carter was that she was expanding the genre, but that nuance was not captured. It did not travel as fast as the binaries do, which is, is this black, is this country music, is this political, or is this subversive? But I truly do think the whole point of Cowboy Carter was just to expand the genre. Like, there's so many different ways that country music can look and sound, and same with the black music as well. And I think another thing that the internet has, the impacts of the internet, is that identity is kind of changed to something that you don't just have, but it's something that you broadcast. So like, identity in itself has kind of become its own content genre, its own aesthetic. And like the idea of this, I really like how cultural theorist Hannah McCann described this and calls it identity curation. So it's like managing your identity like a portfolio, and you have like, identities like the POC, feminist hot takes, sad ethnic girlcore, diaspora humor. This is coming from my algorithm, by the way. It very much speaks to what I'm doing on TikTok. And of course these identities can be like digital home places, but then because of the internet and the internet liking that simplicity, they can also become predictable narrative products. Like, if you are Muslim, then people will expect hijab tutorials and political commentary and Ramadan vlogs. And at that point, that identity becomes a brand rather than just like, this is, this person, this is part of their identity. So of course they might talk about these things, but there's so much more to them. And I feel like sometimes that pressure can be suffocating. And I think another good example of this is like the red pill masculinity that's kind of on the up, unfortunately, these days. Someone did some research on masculinity and called this moment masculinities in crisis. So, Michael Kimmel's research found that these days, masculinity online is hyper-coded, it's aesthetic, and it's algorithmically amplified. We've got terms like Riz masculinity, disciplined king energy, Sigma grind set 2.0, husband school, biohacking for men, soft red pill rebrands. And so these are, all of those things are identity scripts that it's easy to adopt under pressure. And, there's a lot of pressure in our world. That friction I was talking about, we all feeling it. And that complexity kind of gets rejected. And then you have the internet and they offer that certainty. It's like, look at this ready-made identity. And I know that you fit into this story because I know how you feel. You see what I mean by like systems being able to socialize our, valid human emotions, and it provides this way out of confusion. We've also got that tension between like the left and right. And I feel like personally, identity discourse on both ends is hella exhausted. Because on one side you have perfection politics and constant corrections and ideological audits and if you don't know this framework or, are you even conscious? Like, are you even woke? And then on the other hand, you have like men are under attack and everything woke is bad and just dehumanizing the heck out of marginalized groups and like prompting like culture wars. And both extremes use identity as a weapon, not a bridge to like try to cross this sea of complexity that we need to wade through. It's absolutely being used as a weapon. And you know what really speeds up that weapon? Misinformation. I feel like these days misinformation is personalized. Joan Donovan, a media scholar, calls this identity-driven misinformation. And the way that what identity-driven misinformation relies on, it relies on pre-existing stereotypes, racial fears, cultural anxieties, polarized scripts. So, identity becomes the hook. And you see what I'm trying to say about, our emotions being socialized. Identity-driven misinformation, identity becomes the emotional entry point. And you can see how the stereotypes and the fears and the anxieties, identity can kind of come in, swoop on that and be like, well, here's some clarity, here's the simplicity to reduce that friction, but it's actually not reducing that friction in any way, shape or form. And then also another thing that I have noticed yes, definitely seen this happen in real life, but particularly online, we've kind of entered this oppression Olympics as well. And I think if we were more comfortable with our identities, then we would be more comfortable with embracing the intersectionality of it all, right? And understanding that our intersectionality is like a lens in which to view this world. But because the internet has completely, steamrolled the complexity out of everything, identity has also become a weird ranking system of oppression, Olympics. Online identity often has now kind of become a moral currency. It's become a legitimacy scoring. It decides who gets to speak and who stays silent. And when identity is kind of turned into oppression Olympics like that, there's like no room for context. There's no room for solidarity or collective power. There's no room for collaboration. There's just none of that when oppression Olympics is prioritized. And, the internet, I think that especially the algorithm, it relies on the fact that things are simple to keep running. Platforms aren't built for truth, they're built for attention. And when you really realize that, you can just see how we're just hooked in, and there's like that attention, and the way that our systems exist as well, and the way that they remain the status quo is like they need that simplicity to function. And so the internet needs to flatten us to keep running, but that's not what humanity is. We are not built to be flattened, and identity is so complex and ever changing and a forever thing. So I'm not saying that I have all of the answers in the world. This is something that is so complex. But I think the key questions that we do need to ask ourselves is like, how do we honor identity without being trapped in it? How do we stay principled without becoming rigid? And how do we hold moral clarity and emotional nuance? And I think those questions really help us or guide us in moving through the complexity that is the world. Because how earlier I was saying that little disclaimer of of course there is a line, and there are some things where it really is not that complicated. This is not right. But then there are some things where we really do need to invite that complexity and that nuance to get to a place where there's more understanding of each other, because there's so much difference in our world, and we all need to learn how to live with each other, and we need to live in a world where our systems do not silence or marginalize anyone. And I think those questions, they're not the answers or the solutions, but I think these questions really capture that the complexity of it all. Especially that how do we hold moral clarity and emotional nuance, and how do we stay principled without becoming rigid? And I think a key thing to understand here is that identity is relational. Judith Butler makes a really good argument that identity is not a thing that we possess. It's a thing that we perform in relation to others. So what the heck does that mean? Identity changes depending on who we're with, the context, our safety, our community, our sense of belonging. So, changing isn't hypocrisy at all, though, the system and the internet would like to tell us that it is. But it's adaptation, it's survival, and it's growth. And it's always been that way. So, identity is very much a relational thing. And And I think another really important thing to consider is that identity, it should be a doorway, not a prison. And I think identity is a really beautiful starting point to, invite us to question the stories that we tell ourselves when we're moving through this world, the map that guides us in this life. It is a good starting point when we're thinking about the lens in which we view this world, the filters in which we process information and our systems, and the way that we relate to other people. And identity is a really wonderful starting point for that. So when you think about it like that, identity is not a destination. Like, we should allow identity to be the lens in which we enter through, and it's the anchor and the grounding, but it's also not the limit. It's not the script. It's not the cage, and it's not the algorithm. And it's not something that is experienced in isolation. When identity, it is relational. So that, relation really relies on community, and community is everything. It's something that we hear a lot, like the power of the collective. And, we know that part of that cost of having community is inconvenience. And I think why that cost of community is worth it is, sometimes healthy community means being misunderstood. Healthy community looks like apologizing. Healthy community is sitting in that tension. Healthy community is being corrected gently. Healthy community looks like staying when it's awkward. Healthy community means adjusting when it's needed. And healthy community is choosing repair over cancellation. And so, identity performance, which is what the internet prioritizes, it builds audiences. But identity honesty, and that starts with being honest with yourself and the people around you, it builds community. And we need more community, not necessarily audience. Not that there's anything wrong with being part of an audience or building audiences. And being part of an audience is, being part of digital home places, but we need community, and being honest about our identity with ourselves and with people around us, it builds that community. And community holds space for that complexity, because healthy community, when you're staying when it's awkward and choosing that repair and sitting in that tension, like, that's where the growth comes through. That is where the nuance comes through. And I think if we did more of that, the solutions and how to live with each other despite our differences will come about, and the solutions to our systems will come about as well. And so I think it's really important that we choose that honesty around our identity. And I think resisting that algorithmic flattening is so important, because the algorithm wants that consistency and that predictability, the branding, the loyalty, and the identity performance. But I think resisting that, it can come in many forms, but it could look like surprising people. It could look like evolving publicly. It could be, sharing things which are air tags around this off-brand, having days where you don't post, and just, overall refusing to be a mascot for your identity and allowing space for that honesty and the ever-evolving nature of our identities. I think essentially what I'm trying to say is that, you are not an aesthetic for other people to consume. So resist that algorithmic flattening and refuse to become an aesthetic. And I know that, the internet is complicated because it opens so many doors, right? And it's so accessible. And, there's good that comes from the internet. The things that I've learnt, the communities that I've been exposed to, the hot takes and tips and tricks, like they've all been amazing. But I think we have to keep mindfully consuming it and mindfully keep using it in a way where our humanity is still ours, whether it's in real life or online. And I think it's really easy for that humanity to be lost online. It's really easy to become an aesthetic as opposed to just being you online, right? And so I think I really want to bring it home that you are not an aesthetic for other people to consume. And when we embrace that, our humanity and the complexity of it, we're able to build that community. And whether that community is in real life or it's the online community, I think when that's prioritized, there is room to build a shared purpose. And I think that shared purpose should really be the fuel for our solidarity. I think when our identities can become packaged into aesthetics, then there's this sense of solidarity that is now built on sameness. And I think a really good way of thinking about it is Arundhati Roy. They had a vision of a world where many worlds fit. And I think that is a beautiful antidote to the friction that is ever increasing in our world. I'm just dreaming of a world where many worlds fit. And when you think about it like that, it's not saying that we all have to be the same or we all have to package ourselves into one world. We are living in a world where many worlds fit. And you see this, a world where many worlds fit. You see little slivers of it, so whether it's online or in real life. And I think that's so beautiful. When you think about Indigenous climate movements uniting across the world, when you think about cross-ethnic feminist coalitions coming together, when you think about the solidarity among marginalized groups, I'm thinking of Tangata Whenua and Palestine. And so when you think about it like that, solidarity is not sameness. It is shared purpose. And a world where many worlds fit is a world where humanity, our full humanness is prioritized, and identity is not flattened into this simple thing, into a script. And I think that solidarity across difference is really important. I love it when you stumble across words that just really describe how you think about things. And I think a world where many worlds fit is just one of those things. And, you know, I know that this is really hard to navigate, but I think we also need to make space for being wrong and to allow that repair. You know, it just, especially in cancel culture, being wrong feels like a death sentence, right? But being wrong is to be human. And, you know, being committed to moving in this world ethically means, you know, it means to make a mistake. And, you know, there are moments where people thrive when people can ask or change, reflect, get it wrong, and come back, apologize, and grow. And I think cancel culture, there is that sense of accountability, right? But I think sometimes cancel culture, there isn't any repair. And I feel like accountability without repair is just straight up punishment. And, you know, sometimes that punishment is warranted. Like, again, with that, like, there's a line, and there are some things that are just not complicated. But with the complexity of it all, accountability without repair is just punishment, and punishment doesn't lead to growth. And I think also another thing that I want to talk about when it comes to like being wrong and this like simplified world that we're living in is sometimes I've noticed this, especially with the like response to Lily Allen's new album, is that now there's this idea of like the perfect victim. You know, this album where Lily Allen is talking about how her ex-husband really did her wrong, really did her dirty. And she's speaking honestly about that experience. And, you know, people saying, well, you know, boycott the album, or like, what, she cannot be a victim because she did XYZ to other people. And I think it's like we can only understand this if you are the perfect victim. And again, I'm not here to invalidate what Lily Allen has done to other people, but I'm also not here to invalidate what was done to her. And I think the idea or the moral standard of like the perfect victim, it just doesn't exist. Sometimes, like, it's complicated. And so I think we do need to make space for being wrong and make space for that repair as well. And I think another key thing that we need to hold on to is like holding that moral clarity and the emotional complexity. And I think this, like, you know, if we're walking along a tightrope, like the tightrope clearly doesn't exist for this online. I think it's the nuance that the internet really struggles with, because I think some issues are not morally complicated, like genocide and ethnic cleansing and state violence and apartheid and oppression. But people are emotionally complex when it comes to how they learn, how they grieve, how they radicalize, how they disconnect, how they build courage, how they unlearn harmful ideas. And you know, both of those things can be true at the same time. And that's why knowing your identity, I think, is so important, because people are emotionally complex. Like, there are some things that are just not morally complicated, but people are emotionally complex with how they, you know, unpack how they even look at this world and how they move through this world. And it is emotionally complex how you learn and grieve and disconnect and build courage. And so I think we can hold space for clear ethics and soft humanity at the same time. But the internet makes us feel like we cannot do that. But I'm telling you, we can, y'all. And part of holding clear ethics and soft humanity is how we refuse identity as an aesthetic, and having our identity, which is something that is full of mountains and valleys and peaks and troughs, and not be flattened into something that is 2D. And knowing our identity and allowing our identity to be experienced and perceived in its fullness, whether it's in person or online. I think is a really clear pathway to holding clear ethics and soft humanity at the same time. And so, what I want to say is that identity is a lens and it's not the whole camera. And it's so important in 2026 that we honor identity, we reject identity essentialism, we embrace the contradiction, we choose the complexity, we resist binary thinking, we build across differences, we root ourselves in moral clarity, we make space for growth, and we stop letting algorithms define our humanity. And it's so important that we do that, because with this increasing friction and tension, I think the world is going to tell us through our identities, this is how we reduce the friction. This is, how we put out the metaphorical fire. And that's not true. We need, I feel like if we want to get to a place where we are living in a world where many worlds fit, we need to hold clear ethics and soft humanity at the same time. We need to be asking ourselves, how do we honor identity without being trapped in it? How do we stay principled without becoming rigid? How do we hold moral clarity and emotional nuance? We need to be asking ourselves those questions if we want to be living in a world where many worlds fit. And I think it's so important that we try to find that world as soon as possible, because the friction is getting a lot. The heat is getting hotter. There's so much happening, and we need to find that world stat. So yes, identity matters deeply, and I hope that this year and for all of the years to come, that is something that you keep prioritizing for yourself, and it's something that you keep on exploring, because it is ever evolving, and having that identity and knowing your identity is so important. It is a foundation. But please remember, when we live in a world where our humanity is, our humanity, so therefore our identity is something that our world is pushing us to simplify, that, our identity is not the full story, and we are more than our labels. And I think, the most radical thing we can do in a world trying to flatten us is to push for and insist on our fullness. We contain multitudes and layers, okay? And the multitudes very much matter. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns, and may we have an amazing 2026 ahead of us. Thanks y'all for tuning in.
Thank you for tuning in into another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. To keep spinning the yarns, let us know your thoughts. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Headscarves and Good Yarns, or email us at headscarvesandgoodyarn@gmail.com.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.